Hi, this is Matt. Today I'm doing a review of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. And Walden is a classic of literature and can also be considered a classic of environmental literature as well. And just before I jump into the review, you should just note that I am reviewing Walden from the perspective of what we can learn from it about how to care for the natural environment. So this is not meant as a literary analysis or literary criticism. It's simply looking at the book from an environmentalist's perspective. So that said, Walden was published by Henry David Thoreau in 1854. And Thoreau was a man of many talents, but amongst these he was a writer and a naturalist and a philosopher. And it's my understanding that Thoreau's writing and Thoreau's thinking was kind of considered a precursor to what later became the modern environmental movement. So the book itself is an autobiographical account of Thoreau's this experiment that he did, in which he went out into the woods near his hometown of Concord, Massachusetts, and he built a cabin for himself and lived in solitude in the woods for 2 years. And this cabin was built next to a pond called Walden Pond, which is where the book gets its name. So throughout the book, Thoreau describes his experiences living in the woods in solitude. So he spends quite a lot of time describing the natural environment around him, and he also devotes a lot of time to describing exactly how it is he lives. So he talks about how he built the cabin and how he goes about farming vegetables and catching fish and just all the sorts of things that would occupy the life of a hermit living in the woods. But interwoven throughout this, Thoreau explores various philosophical ideas. And to be honest, I personally found the book quite challenging to read because the pace of the writing is very slow, and as I said, he explores all these philosophical ideas, and in doing so, Thoreau tends to go off on a lot of different tangents and refer to a bunch of things which I didn't necessarily know very much about because I didn't know the context of the time period. As I said, this was written in 1854, which is more than 150 years ago. But that said, I think there is most certainly a lot of insight and wisdom that you can glean from this book. And a bunch of the key themes are especially relevant to modern environmental concerns. So first, Thoreau is very critical of consumerism and materialism. And this actually came as something of a surprise to me because I thought that, given the book was written in 1854, this would be well before the modern consumer age, before the time of us being flooded with adverts to buy the next, newest, latest thing. But I guess, back even more than 150 years ago, people were still like they are today, wanting to upgrade, wanting to accumulate more material stuff in the hope that it would give them some kind of satisfaction or happiness. And so this really ties in with the core theme of the book, which is the value of living simply. And so this whole experiment that Thoreau did by going out into the woods and living by himself for 2 years was an exercise in simple living. So he wanted to see what would happen to him and what he would feel like to live with just the bare essentials for life. And he did indeed find that he could live a good and satisfactory life full of contentment in this setting. The other theme that I think is really important in the book is the value of spending time connecting or reconnecting with nature. And just the joy and wonder that Thoreau feels at getting to spend time in nature is very apparent throughout the whole book. And I think by reading Walden, we can kind of vicariously experience Thoreau's experiences. We can vicariously feel what it's like to live this life of solitude, because not all of us, or most of us, are not going to have the time or the inclination to go and spend 2 years out in the wilderness by ourselves. And so by reading Walden, I think we can really get some inspiration that'll help us to reconnect with nature and learn to appreciate it more. And of course, if people learn to appreciate nature more, then they will most probably feel more compelled to care for it. So to summarize, I'm a little bit cautious about recommending Walden to everyone because, as I said, it is a tough read, at least for me it was. You know, and if you're not that well acquainted with reading literary fiction or non-fiction, it can be pretty difficult to get through. You might find it boring even. If you would be interested in a book that is covers similar themes to Walden, but is not necessarily, is more accessible and more modern and more easy to read, then I would highly recommend A Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. And I've done a review of that. It's a fantastic book. But that said, Walden is a classic for a reason. And I think if you have the patience and you are able to digest Thoreau's writing, then there most certainly is beauty and wisdom and insight and inspiration to be found in the pages of this book. So that concludes the review, and I would just like to close with a quote from the book. And this is probably the most famous quote in Walden, and in it Thoreau describes his motivation for doing this whole experiment. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived.